The moon hung low and yellow over the tangled canopy of the black forest, its light barely piercing the ancient pines as Franklin Hayes stumbled through the undergrowth, his breath coming in ragged clouds. The air was thick with the scent of moss and wet earth, every shadow alive with the threat of something watching, waiting. He could still hear the echo of his son's laughter, Eric's voice, sharp and cruel, ringing out as he tossed Franklin's backpack into the darkness and turned away. "Let the wolves find you, old man," Eric had shouted, his flashlight bobbing through the trees as he disappeared, leaving Franklin alone in the heart of a place that had haunted his nightmares since childhood. The cold bit through Franklin's jacket, his hands numb as he tried to orient himself, the world spinning with disbelief and a growing icy rage. He replayed the day's events in his mind, Eric's impatience as they set up camp, the way he'd mocked Franklin's stories about the forest, the way he'd rolled his eyes when Franklin warned him not to wander too far after dark. But nothing had prepared him for the moment Eric's face twisted with contempt, for the way his own son had looked at him like a burden, a joke, something to be discarded. The forest seemed to close in, every snap of a twig, every distant howl, a reminder that he was truly alone. Franklin's heart pounded as he stumbled forward, desperate to find a path, a landmark, anything that would lead him out. The legends of the Black Forest pressed in on him. Stories of men who vanished, of spirits that lured travelers off the path, of wolves that hunted in packs, silent and relentless. But nothing haunted him more than the memory of Eric's smirk, the sound of his laughter fading into the night. If you enjoy powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Franklin's mind raced with memories of raising Eric, of the sacrifices he'd made, of the love he'd given so freely. Now, all of it seemed to have vanished in the darkness, replaced by a chilling sense of betrayal. He found shelter beneath a fallen tree, his body aching, his breath shallow as he tried to build a fire with trembling hands. The wind howled through the branches, carrying with it the distant sound of wolves. Franklin shivered, his resolve hardening with every passing hour. He would not die here. He would not let Eric's cruelty be the end of his story. As the night deepened, Franklin forced himself to remember his training, how to build a fire, how to find water, how to keep moving. He used every skill he'd ever learned, every lesson his own father had taught him. The flickering flame cast eerie shadows on the trees, but it also gave him hope. As dawn broke, Franklin was exhausted but alive, his resolve hardening with every step. He promised himself that if he made it out, he would make Eric understand what he'd done. The forest was a maze, but Franklin refused to give in to panic. He followed the sound of running water, knowing that rivers always led somewhere. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, and Franklin felt a surge of determination. He would survive. He would find his way home. And when he did, he would make sure Eric never forgot the night he left his father for dead. The first light of dawn crept through the tangled branches, painting the black forest in shades of gray and gold, and Franklin Hayes forced himself to his feet, every muscle aching from a night spent shivering beneath a fallen tree. The fire he'd managed to coax from damp twigs had burned out hours ago, leaving only a curl of smoke and the faint warmth of embers. He checked his pockets. No phone, no map, just a battered pocket knife and the stubborn will that had carried him through harder times. The forest was silent now, the howls of wolves replaced by the distant call of a crow and the soft drip of melting frost. Franklin's mind replayed Eric's laughter, the way his son had looked back one last time, flashlight beams slicing through the dark, before vanishing into the trees. The betrayal stung deeper than the cold. He thought of all the years he'd spent teaching Eric to respect the woods, to never leave a man behind, to honor the bond between father and son. Now those lessons felt like ashes in his mouth. But Franklin was not a man to give up. He scanned the ground for tracks, found the faint imprint of Eric's boots, and began to follow, moving slowly, careful not to lose the trail. Every step was a test of memory and instinct. He remembered the way the river curved near the old logging road, the moss that always grew on the north side of the trees, the trick of listening for running water when all else failed. As the sun climbed higher, Franklin's hunger gnawed at him, but he pushed on, driven by a mix of anger and determination. He stumbled once, catching his foot on a root, and nearly fell into a shallow ravine. For a moment he lay there, staring up at the sky, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. But then he heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of a car engine in the distance. Hope surged through him. He scrambled to his feet, following the sound, his heart pounding as the trees began to thin. At the edge of the forest, he saw a dirt road, muddy and rutted, but blessedly real. A battered pickup truck was parked 100 yards away, its driver leaning against the hood, smoking a cigarette. Franklin waved, his voice hoarse. "Hey, over here." The man looked up, startled, then jogged over, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You all right, old-timer? You look like you've seen a ghost." Franklin managed a weak smile. "Something like that." The man, who introduced himself as Carl, helped Franklin into the truck, handed him a thermos of coffee, and listened in stunned silence as Franklin told his story. "Your own son left you out there?" Carl shook his head, anger flashing in his eyes. "That's not right. Not right at all." As they drove toward town, Franklin stared out the window, the forest receding behind him, and began to plot his next move. He would not call the police, not yet. He wanted Eric to feel the fear, the uncertainty, the helplessness he'd felt in the woods. He wanted his son to understand that actions have consequences, that betrayal cuts both ways. By the time they reached Carl's farmhouse, Franklin had a plan. He borrowed Carl's phone, called a cab, and made his way back to the city. He let himself into Eric's house with the spare key, his heart pounding as he waited in the kitchen, the hours ticking by. When Eric finally walked in, laughing with friends, his face turned white at the sight of his father standing by the stove. Franklin met his gaze, his voice cold and steady. "Now it's your turn to be scared." The room went silent, and for the first time, Eric understood what it meant to be truly alone. The kitchen was thick with tension, the only sound the slow drip of the faucet and the distant hum of traffic outside. Eric's friends, caught off guard by Franklin's sudden appearance, exchanged nervous glances and quickly made excuses to leave, their laughter dying as they slipped out the door. Eric stood frozen, his face pale, his bravado gone. For a long moment, Father and son stared at each other, the silence between them heavier than any words. Franklin broke it first, his voice low and cold. "You left me to die, Eric. You thought the wolves would finish what you started." Eric tried to stammer out a defense, but Franklin cut him off with a raised hand. "Don't bother. I saw the look in your eyes. You wanted me gone." Eric's shoulders slumped, shame and fear flickering across his face. I didn't think you'd make it out. I just wanted to scare you, Dad. You didn't mean for me to survive," Franklin finished, his words sharp as a blade. He stepped closer, his presence suddenly towering, the years of disappointment and betrayal boiling to the surface. "You want to know what it's like to be truly alone? To feel the cold in your bones? To hear the wolves howling and wonder if you'll see the sun again? You're about to find out." Eric's eyes widened, panic rising as Franklin laid out his plan. "You're going to spend the next week living like I did. No friends, no money, no help. I've already called your boss and told him you're taking a leave of absence. Your credit cards are frozen. Your phone is locked. You'll have to survive on your wits just like I did." Eric sputtered, anger flaring. "You can't do this. You're my father." Franklin's expression hardened. A father protects his son. A son doesn't abandon his father in the woods. Consider this your lesson. He handed Eric a small backpack. Inside, a flashlight, a bottle of water, and a map of the city's parks and shelters. "You'll check in with me every night. If you cheat, if you try to run, I'll go to the police and tell them everything. About the drugs, the debts, the lies." Eric's face crumpled, the weight of his actions finally settling on his shoulders. "Please, Dad. I'm sorry. I was stupid. I was angry. I didn't mean—" "You meant every word," Franklin said, his voice softening just a fraction. "But maybe if you survive this, you'll understand what it means to be a man." He turned and walked out, leaving Eric alone in the kitchen, the silence now his only companion. As Franklin stepped into the cold night, he felt a strange sense of peace. The reckoning had begun, and for the first time, Eric would have to face the consequences of his choices. The city was vast and unforgiving, but Franklin knew that sometimes, the only way to teach a lesson was to let someone walk through the darkness on their own. As he disappeared into the shadows, he wondered if Eric would find his way back, or if the wolves, real or imagined, would claim him after all. The first night of Eric's forced exile was a study in humiliation and fear, a mirror of the terror Franklin had felt in the Black Forest. Eric wandered the city's empty streets, the neon glow of bars and late-night diners mocking his isolation. He tried calling friends, but the phone Franklin had left him was locked to all but one number, Franklin's. He tried his credit cards at an ATM, only to find them declined, the screen flashing a cold, impersonal message, "Contact your bank." The city, once a playground, now felt like a labyrinth of locked doors and cold shoulders. Eric spent the night in a park, shivering beneath a thin blanket, the sounds of distant sirens and the rustle of leaves keeping him awake. Hunger gnawed at him, and by morning, he was desperate enough to line up at a soup kitchen, his pride dissolving with every step. Franklin watched from a distance, his heart heavy but resolute. He checked in with Eric each night, their conversations terse and raw. "How was your day?" Franklin would ask. "Cold. Hungry. Alone," Eric would reply, his voice stripped of arrogance. Good, Franklin would say. Now you know. As the days passed, Eric's anger gave way to exhaustion, then to a kind of clarity. He saw the city's invisible people, the men and women who slept in doorways, who lined up for food, who moved through the world unseen. He listened to their stories, realizing that most had once had families, jobs, homes. He began to understand the fear and shame that had haunted Franklin in the forest, the sense of being abandoned by the one person you thought you could trust. On the fourth night, Eric called Franklin, his voice shaking. Dad, I'm sorry. I get it now. I was cruel. I was selfish. I don't know how to fix it. Franklin listened, his own voice softening. You start by surviving, by admitting you were wrong, by asking for help, not demanding it. Eric wept, the sound raw and unguarded. I want to come home. Franklin paused, the silence stretching between them. Not yet. You have 3 more days. Use them well. Eric nodded, even though Franklin couldn't see him. I will. That night, as Franklin sat by his window watching the city lights flicker, he felt a strange sense of hope. The lesson was working. Eric was changing. But Franklin knew the hardest part was still to come. Forgiveness was not a gift to be given lightly. It had to be earned one hard night at a time. As the city slept, Franklin whispered a prayer for his son, for himself, and for the chance to build something new from the ashes of betrayal. By the 6th night, the city's indifference had worn Eric raw. His face was gaunt, his clothes rumpled, and the bravado that once defined him had been stripped away by hunger, cold, and the relentless ache of loneliness. He spent his days wandering from shelter to shelter, learning the unspoken rules of survival, how to keep your head down, how to spot trouble before it found you, how to accept kindness without letting it bruise your pride. Franklin watched from a distance, sometimes sitting in his car across the street, sometimes blending in with the crowd at the soup kitchen, always resisting the urge to step in. He saw Eric's shoulders slump a little more each day, saw the way he flinched at sudden noises, the way he lingered outside the bakery just to inhale the scent of fresh bread. On the 7th night, Eric's world shrank to a single, terrifying moment. He was sleeping on a bench in a quiet park when a group of teenagers approached, their laughter sharp and mean. "Hey, old man's son, what's it like to be homeless?" one sneered, recognizing him from school. They circled him, taunting, shoving, until one of them grabbed his backpack and dumped its contents onto the ground. Eric tried to fight back, but exhaustion and fear made him clumsy. The boys scattered as a police car rounded the corner, leaving Eric on his knees, shaking and humiliated. The officer helped him up, his voice gentle. "You okay, son?" Eric nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I just want to go home." That night, Eric called Franklin, his voice broken. "Dad, I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I need help." Franklin listened, his own heart breaking, but he knew the lesson had finally sunk in. "Come to the house," he said quietly. "We'll talk." When Eric arrived, Franklin met him at the door, his arms open. For a long moment they just stood there, father and son, the weight of the past week pressing down on them. "I'm sorry, Dad," Eric whispered. I was so angry. I thought I was teaching you a lesson, but I was the one who needed to learn." Franklin hugged him, his own tears falling. "We both learned, son. Now let's figure out how to move forward." As they sat together in the kitchen, the city quiet outside, Franklin realized that forgiveness was not about forgetting the past, but about choosing to build something better. The wolves of the Black Forest were far behind them now, but the lessons they'd learned would shape their lives forever. The first morning after Eric returned home, the house felt different, warmer but also tense, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see if this fragile peace would hold. Franklin made breakfast, the familiar ritual grounding him, but Eric barely touched his food, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion and shame. They spoke little, the silence between them filled with all the things that still needed to be said. Later that day, Franklin walked into town to pick up groceries, his head held high but his heart pounding. He could feel the eyes of neighbors on him, their whispers following him down the aisles. Some looked away, embarrassed by their own complicity in the gossip that had swirled since the night Eric left him in the forest. Others offered awkward nods or forced smiles, unsure whether to offer sympathy or judgment. At the checkout, Mrs. Callahan, who had known Franklin since he was a boy, leaned in and whispered, "I heard what happened. I'm so sorry, Franklin. No one deserves that." Her kindness brought tears to his eyes, but it was the next encounter that truly tested him. Outside the store, a group of Eric's old friends stood waiting, their faces a mix of curiosity and contempt. "So you're taking him back?" one asked, his tone mocking. "After what he did?" Franklin met their gaze, his voice steady. "He's my son. He made a mistake. But I believe people can change, if they're given the chance." The boys scoffed, but one, quieter than the rest, nodded in understanding. As Franklin walked home, groceries in hand, he realized that the real challenge was not just forgiving Eric, but facing a community that had already decided who was the villain and who was the victim. That evening, Eric asked if he could come with Franklin to the support group at the community center. "I want to tell them what I did," he said, his voice trembling. "I want to apologize." Franklin agreed, pride and anxiety warring in his chest. At the meeting, Eric stood before the group, his confession raw and unvarnished. "I left my father in the woods. I thought I was teaching him a lesson, but I was the one who needed to learn. I'm sorry." The room was silent, then slowly, one by one, people began to clap, not for the mistake but for the courage to admit it. Franklin hugged his son, the weight of judgment lifting just a little. He realized that true strength was not found in revenge but in compassion, in the willingness to forgive, to rebuild, to face the world together. As they walked home under the stars, Franklin felt hope blooming in his chest, fragile but real. The forest was behind them, but the journey toward healing had only just begun. The days that followed Eric's confession at the support group were a delicate balancing act, each moment a test of trust and resolve. Eric threw himself into making amends, volunteering at the shelter, helping Franklin with chores, and even apologizing to neighbors who had heard the rumors. Some accepted his words with cautious optimism, others with skepticism, but Franklin saw the change in his son's eyes, a humility and hunger for redemption that hadn't been there before. Just as the wounds between father and son began to heal, a new crisis erupted. One afternoon, as Franklin was tending the garden, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. Officer Ramirez, the same man who had once helped Franklin after his escape from the forest, stepped out, his face grave. "Mr. Hayes, I need to speak with you and Eric." Inside, the officer explained that a local business had been robbed the night before, and Eric's name had come up in the investigation. Someone matching his description was seen near the scene. "We have to ask some questions." Eric's face went white, panic flickering in his eyes. "I didn't do anything, Dad. I swear." Franklin's heart pounded, torn between the instinct to protect his son and the knowledge that trust had to be earned, not given blindly. "We'll answer your questions, officer," Franklin said, his voice steady. "But I know my son. He's trying to change." The interview was tense, Eric's hands shaking as he recounted his movements the night before. Franklin watched the officer's face, searching for any sign of doubt or accusation. When the questioning was over, Ramirez nodded. "We'll check the security footage. If Eric's telling the truth, it'll clear him." As the officer left, Franklin turned to his son, his voice gentle but firm. "If you're lying to me, Eric, I need to know now." Eric shook his head, tears in his eyes. "I'm not, Dad. I promise." The next 24 hours were agony, the old fear and suspicion creeping back in. Franklin replayed every conversation, every moment of progress, wondering if he'd been a fool to believe in second chances. But when Ramirez returned the next day, his face was relaxed. The footage cleared Eric. He was at the shelter all night. "Someone tried to use his name to throw us off." Relief flooded Franklin, but so did a new resolve. He realized that forgiveness was not a one-time act, but a daily choice. A commitment to believe in the possibility of change, even when the world tried to drag you back into the darkness. That night, as father and son sat together on the porch, Franklin put an arm around Eric's shoulders. "We're not out of the woods yet, son. But I'm proud of you. Keep going." Eric nodded, his gratitude shining in his eyes. The crisis had tested them both, but it had also proven that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt, one honest day at a time. The crisis passed, and with it came a new sense of possibility that Franklin Hayes hadn't felt in years. The community, having witnessed Eric's exoneration and his efforts to make amends, began to soften. Neighbors who once crossed the street now waved from their porches, and the shelter director invited Eric to help lead a new outreach program for at-risk youth. One morning, as Franklin and Eric sat on the porch sipping coffee, a letter arrived from the city council. It was an invitation to speak at a town hall about their story, about survival, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. Franklin hesitated, unsure if he was ready to share the darkest chapter of his life with strangers, but Eric was eager. "Dad, if our story can help even one person, it's worth it." They spent evenings preparing, writing, and rewriting their speech, practicing in the living room until the words felt like their own. The night of the event, the town hall was packed. Franklin stood at the podium, the lights bright and the room silent, and told the story of the Black Forest. The betrayal, the fear, the long walk home. He spoke of the pain of being left behind, of the anger and shame, but also of the moment he decided to fight for his son, not against him. Eric followed, his voice trembling at first but growing stronger as he described his week on the streets, the humiliation, the hunger, the realization that he had become the very thing he'd once mocked. "I thought I was teaching my dad a lesson," Eric said, "but I was the one who needed to learn what it means to be a man." The applause was thunderous, and afterward people lined up to thank them, to share their own stories, to ask for advice. The local paper ran a story about the event, and soon Franklin and Eric were invited to speak at schools, shelters, and even a regional conference on family reconciliation. The experience transformed them both. Franklin found new purpose in helping others, his pain transformed into compassion, his scars a testament to the possibility of renewal. Eric, too, discovered a sense of belonging and responsibility he'd never known. He became a mentor to younger men at the shelter, his story a warning and a beacon. As the weeks passed, father and son grew closer, their bond forged in the crucible of hardship and healing. The Black Forest was now a memory, a lesson, a turning point. The greatest revenge, Franklin realized, was not in retribution but in living well, in building a life of dignity, kindness, and hope. As they walked home from the town hall, the stars bright above and the city quiet around them, Franklin put his arm around Eric's shoulders and smiled. "We made it, son. We really made it." And for the first time, Eric smiled back, the weight of the past finally lifting as they stepped into the future together. The weeks after the town hall were filled with a new, almost fragile sense of hope. Franklin and Eric found themselves busier than ever, volunteering, speaking, and slowly rebuilding the trust that had once seemed lost forever. But just as the wounds of the past began to heal, an unexpected visitor arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Franklin was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find a woman standing on the porch, her umbrella dripping, her eyes searching his face with a mix of fear and determination. "Mr. Hayes?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My name is Lila. I knew your wife. And I knew Eric years ago." Franklin's heart skipped. He invited her in, offering a towel and a cup of tea. Lila sat at the table, her hands wrapped around the mug, her gaze flicking nervously between Franklin and Eric, who had joined them, curiosity and unease written on his face. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," Lila began, "but I have something I need to tell you. Something I should have said a long time ago." She reached into her bag and pulled out a faded envelope, sliding it across the table to Franklin. "Your wife gave this to me before she died. She asked me to hold on to it, to give it to you if things ever got bad." Franklin's hands shook as he opened the envelope, pulling out a letter in his late wife's familiar handwriting. The words were raw, honest, and full of love. She spoke of her fears for Eric, her hopes for Franklin, and a secret she had kept for years. A small savings account in Eric's name, meant to be a lifeline if he ever lost his way. "If you're reading this," she wrote, "it means you both need a reminder that forgiveness is always possible, and that family is worth fighting for." Tears streamed down Franklin's face as he read the letter aloud, the room silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. Eric wept openly, his shoulders shaking with the weight of regret and gratitude. Lila smiled through her own tears. She loved you both so much. She wanted you to have a second chance. The discovery of the account was a shock, but it was the message of the letter that mattered most. a final gift from the woman who had held their family together, even from beyond the grave. That night, as Franklin and Eric sat together in the living room, the letter between them, they talked about the past, the future, and the promise to honor her memory by living with courage, kindness, and forgiveness. The visitor had brought closure, but also a reminder. The story was not just about survival, but about the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. The discovery of his late wife's letter and the secret savings account brought a new sense of purpose to Franklin and Eric's lives, but it also set the stage for one final test neither of them saw coming. With the account, Franklin and Eric decided to expand their outreach, funding a new program at the shelter for young men at risk of homelessness and violence. The project drew attention from the local press and city officials, and soon Franklin found himself invited to speak at a regional conference on family reconciliation. The night before the event, as Franklin rehearsed his speech in the living room, Eric burst through the door, his face pale and eyes wide with panic. "Dad, I just got a call from the police. One of the boys from the shelter, Jamal, was picked up for shoplifting. They're threatening to shut down the program if we can't prove we're making a difference." Franklin's heart sank. He knew how fragile the trust of the community was, how quickly one mistake could unravel everything they'd built. "We have to help him," Eric said, his voice trembling. "We can't let them use this as an excuse to go back to the way things were." Franklin nodded, his mind racing. They spent the night gathering letters of support, compiling data on the program's success, and preparing to speak on Jamal's behalf at the hearing the next morning. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension and skepticism. Franklin took the stand, his voice steady as he told Jamal's story, not as a statistic, but as a young man who had survived more in 16 years than most people did in a lifetime. He spoke of second chances, of the power of community, of the lessons he and Eric had learned about forgiveness and resilience. Eric followed, his own testimony raw and honest, admitting his past mistakes and vouching for Jamal's character. The judge listened, her expression unreadable, then called for a recess. As they waited in the hallway, Franklin put his arm around Eric's shoulders. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you. We did the right thing." When the judge returned, her verdict was clear. Jamal would be released into Franklin and Eric's care, the program would continue, and the city would provide additional funding for their work. The relief was overwhelming, and as they left the courthouse, Jamal hugged them both, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you. You saved my life." That night, as Franklin and Eric sat on the porch, the stars bright above, they realized that the greatest strength was not in never falling, but in always rising again, together. The last challenge had tested them, but it had also proven that their new legacy was built not on revenge, but on hope, compassion, and the courage to keep moving forward, no matter how many times life tried to knock them down. The months that followed the courtroom victory and Jamal's second chance were a season of transformation for Franklin, Eric, and the entire community. The shelter's new program flourished, drawing in young men who had once been invisible, kids who had slept in cars, hidden in abandoned buildings, or drifted from couch to couch, always one mistake away from disaster. Franklin became a mentor to many, his story a beacon for those who had lost hope. Eric, too, found his calling, pouring his energy into the work, his past mistakes now a source of empathy rather than shame. Together they built something lasting, a network of support, a family forged not by blood but by choice and shared struggle. The city took notice, and soon the mayor's office reached out, offering to fund a new community center in Franklin's name. The grand opening was set for the first day of summer, and as the date approached, the excitement in the neighborhood was palpable. On the day of the celebration, the center was filled with laughter, music, and the smell of barbecue. Old friends and new faces mingled in the sunlit courtyard, sharing stories and dreams for the future. Julia and her children came, their smiles a testament to the healing that had taken root in their family. Elise, the woman who had delivered Franklin's late wife's letter, arrived with her own family, her eyes shining with pride. Even Officer Ramirez stopped by, shaking Franklin's hand and thanking him for showing the city what true courage looked like. As the afternoon wore on, Franklin stood on the stage looking out at the crowd, at Jamal, now a mentor himself, at Eric, his face alight with purpose, at Julia, her laughter ringing out above the music. He raised a glass, his voice steady and full of gratitude. "We've all been lost at some point," he said. "We've all been scared, angry, or alone. But we're here because we chose to keep going, to forgive, to build something better. This center isn't just a building, it's a promise. A promise that no one has to walk through the darkness alone." The applause was thunderous, and as the sun set, Franklin felt a peace deeper than any he had ever known. The celebration was more than a party. It was a declaration that the past would not define them, that the future was theirs to shape. As the stars appeared overhead and the music drifted into the night, Franklin realized that the truest victory was not in payback, but in the family you choose and the lives you change. The journey had been long and hard, but in the end, it had led them all home. The summer air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and fresh-cut grass as Franklin Hayes sat on the porch of the new community center, watching the last rays of sunlight slip behind the city skyline. The laughter of children echoed from the playground, and the hum of conversation drifted from the open windows, a symphony of hope and healing that filled Franklin's heart with a peace he'd never thought possible. Eric sat beside him, his face relaxed, his eyes bright with the quiet confidence of a man who had finally found his place in the world. They talked about the future, about expanding the shelter, about the young men they'd helped, about the family they'd rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. As the evening deepened, a volunteer approached with a small envelope. "This came for you, Mr. Hayes." Hand delivered. Franklin took the envelope, his hand steady, his curiosity piqued. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the return address was from a small town on the edge of the Black Forest. He opened it carefully, unfolding a single sheet of paper. The letter was from a man named Carl, the farmer who had found Franklin stumbling out of the woods all those months ago. "Dear Mr. Hayes, I saw your story in the paper. I wanted you to know that your courage inspired me to reconnect with my own son. We are healing too. Thank you for reminding me that it's never too late to forgive, to hope, to begin again." Franklin felt tears prick his eyes as he read the words, the weight of his journey settling over him like a blessing. He looked at Eric, who smiled and squeezed his shoulder. "You changed more lives than you know, Dad." As the stars appeared overhead, Franklin realized that the greatest legacy was not the revenge he'd once dreamed of, but the love and forgiveness he'd found along the way. The pain of the past would never fully disappear, but it no longer defined him. Instead, he chose to remember the lessons learned, that dignity is worth fighting for, that family is built on trust and second chances, and that the truest victory is not in payback, but in the courage to love, forgive, and begin again. As the night grew quiet and the city lights flickered in the distance, Franklin closed his eyes, grateful for the journey, and ready for whatever tomorrow might bring, knowing that at last he was truly home.